Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming and finding the spot. It's small but mighty crew, and we may have a few stragglers, either finding a location or whatnot. It's a decent day out, so maybe they're walking parks. I am Pierre Bodie, Executive Director, Community Life Collaborative. This is our fourth of our forum series for the Our Nature, looking at environmental justice and environmental stewardship in Northeast Ohio. And we are at the beautiful Killingsworth meeting space with Union Miles Development Corp. Thank you so much for hosting and having us in your location. We're going to be talking about the Greenbook Cleveland with the Cleveland Memory Project and the Cuyahoga Valley National Park. So you'll be hearing from them in a second. But I wanted to start with Tanya. You want to? Latrice. All right, Latrice, good. And there's copies of the presentation that she's going to be going over on each one of the tables. Go and follow her.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am the Planning Project Manager for the Union Miles Development Corporation. In 2 years, it'll be January. In January, it'll be 2 years for me here. I'm serving the Union Miles community. My background is I'm a graduate of the HBCU, Wilberforce University, and I went off to study at Cleveland State College of Urban Affairs, where I've been out there since 2001 with a Muppet degree. My purpose here at Union Miles is to work on a lot of community projects, continuing to beautify the community, promote unity, reduce crime, and just attend to residents' needs and work on various projects. I work on educational projects. We are in partnership with Case Western Reserve University. We're in partnership with St. Martin de Porres High School. So I work on those projects. I have 2 interns from St. Martin de Porres that I work with and introducing them to the field of nonprofit world. And also I work with Case Western Reserve students, university medical students, and social work students to introduce them into the nonprofit community development world as well. Every year, 6 different Case Western Reserve students is assigned to Union Miles, where they research and find improvements for the Union Miles community. I meet with the students twice a month to guide them and mentor them on projects. The students present their findings to Case Western and Union Miles Development Corporation towards the end of their term. They just presented, and they did an awesome job. They presented art history, the history within Union Miles, and why art history and why art is important to bring it to Union Miles Development Corporation, such as using murals and artwork. Every year we have St. Martin de Porres students. Like I said, I got 2 now. They're leaving at the end of May. And they're supervised by me, and they learn how nonprofits work and what they are used for. I also do grant research. I do grant writing, grants management, and grant research and monitoring and compliance for grants that are received to the Union Miles Development Corporation. The plan, as you see on the handout, I research small grants so that funding can be used for urban projects. The following grants have been awarded for the following projects. Union Miles last year received a grant for the National Endowment for the Arts to have designs placed at 6 different RTA bus shelters. We are in partnership with RTA on that project I'm working on. And African American historians within the Union Miles area. As you will see on the handout, we have President Barack Obama. He's going to replace that 1 RTA bus shelter. His concept will be replaced. We also have Stephanie Tubbs Jones. Her concept will be placed at 1 RTA bus shelter. We have Malcolm X. His concept will be placed at 1 RTA bus shelter. Harriet Tubman will be placed at an RTA bus shelter. Fred Hampton will be placed at an RTA bus shelter. And Carl and Lewis Stokes will be placed at an RTA bus shelter. We also receive grants on a yearly basis from the Garden Club of Cleveland. They provide Union Miles grants for ongoing garden expansion projects and gardening projects, and the upkeep of our garden projects. Their funds are used for our sunflower garden, our hoop house, and our Bob Deskins Park that was newly created. The Western Reserve Land Conservancy awards funds to Union Mountain Development Corporation on vacant land projects, and also tree planting and improvement of land development within the Union Mouse community. So we're also working with the Western Reserve Land Conservancy on getting funding in to do vacant projects and things like that, and tree planting. The Cleveland Tree Coalition just received a huge grant, and hopefully we can get some of that to plant some trees in residents, in front of residents' homes, and also in vacant lands. I think that's about it for me. Thank you. Any questions?
Amazing.
All right, we're done.
Hopefully you guys don't mind if I just stand right here. My name is Donald Woodruff. I'm the Director of Real Estate Development here at Union House Development Corp. Actually, this is my second tour here. I was here from 2010 to 2015. Done some things about development and stuff on my own. And I came back a couple months ago for a project we're working on now. Interesting, I worked at Union Miles Development. I was the project manager that actually built the plaza that we're sitting in now. So it feels good to kind of come back and see it being in good use and all that. Worked on a number of projects in the city. The redevelopment of the St. Luke's campus. Worked on the team that helped redevelop that, the hospital and the whole campus. Worked with Amigos Foundation on the Heritage Lane project at East 105th and Wade Park. So I've done some pretty good projects at scale. Right now, Union Miles Development Corporation is working with Ridall Partnership. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Ridall. They've gotten a lot of awards and accolades for their urban agriculture program. So we're working with them on, we're going to be building 11 homes for homeless veterans on 95th and Harvard. So we're working with them. Interestingly enough, bringing it back to what you guys are here for today, the name of the project is the Walter Collins Veterans Homes. Walter Collins works with Ridall, and while he's with Ridall, his focus has just been on helping veterans. So we had a project meeting the other day, and so Mr. Collins is somewhat a equestrian aficionado. He loves horses, and so we were having a conversation. He was saying, I've been around horses since I was about 8 or 9 years old. Him and a partner has a farm in New Mexico where they raise thoroughbreds. So I asked him, I said, well, how'd you get into horses and all that? He said, well, when I was young, and he's probably early 80s, he said, when I was young, we would go out to this farm, Benny Mason's farm in Solon, which is one of the Greenbook sites. So I know he said Benny Mason's farm. I said, that's the place out of Solon. I used to live in Solon. So, I call myself a little history buff. When I first even learned about the Greenbook, which was some years ago, with the movie, I kind of looked up and I heard about Benny Mason's farm. So he would tell me that was like their big time. They would go out to the farm, and that's how he got into horses. Looking at some of the other sites, my father, he's probably close to 80. So I remember a lot of the places, just hearing my father talk about in the Greenbook, the Majestic Hotel, Deering's restaurant that's in there. I think that was actually just torn down some time ago while I was at the Famicos Foundation. So, again, a lot of the sites that are on the Greenbook Cleveland website that I see in the book, there's to a lot of people, there's a connection, and even it's things that last generations later. So again, that's, thank you all for coming, and, really appreciate, all of this. Okay, any questions or anything?
Thank you.
Okay.
Very much. Yeah, appreciate you. So, as Mark and crew would know, we were looking for a location for where we were going to have the conversation about the Green Book. We wanted to be, in the community. We wanted to kind of talk through, in space. So, the Union Miles Development Corps, you guys are the boots on the ground. You guys are really highlighting the culture. You're celebrating history. You have the art installations and all of the other things that you're working on. It's just amazing to hear everything you're working on. So thank you very much. And the personal connection to the Green Book and understanding, that is, thank you. I appreciate that very much. It's wonderful. So with that kind of wrap up, Mark Souder, if you can come give us an overview of Greenbook Cleveland's, and kind of looking, now that we're in the present, we'll take a step back into the past and start talking through. So, Mark.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I'll give you just a very quick summation about myself. I'm a history professor at Cleveland State. I've been at CSU for 20 years. I'm originally from Deep South. I'm from Georgia. I've lived the first half of my life almost in the South before coming up to Cleveland to teach at CSU. I've done a lot of location-based public history, often in digital realms. So web-based and app-based projects like Cleveland Historical, the Cleveland Voices Oral History Project that's interviewed about 1,200 Clevelanders or greater Clevelanders since the early 2000s. And most recently, this project, Greenbook Cleveland. So how did I get interested in this? As a white, Southern-born man, I've always been interested in history, and I've always been, as time has gone on and I've learned more, I've become increasingly interested about the stories that don't get told enough, the stories that go to the grave of the people who knew them. It's why I believe in oral history as a method. It's sometimes the only opportunity that we have to actually create something that's lasting, that really can be passed down other than only by word of mouth. Those stories, if they're not recorded in the original voices of those who remember, they lose something along the way as they're retold. The details slip away. Suppositions replace firsthand experiences. And eventually you lose a lot of the richness that you get from oral history. So I'm a firm believer in that, and that's why oral history has to be and will be an essential part of this project to document both Greenbook sites and sites from the Greenbook era that pertain to Black leisure, recreation, and entertainment in Northeast Ohio. So I've been interested in the Greenbook specifically for about 10 years. I first learned about it about 10 years ago, and as someone who has studied tourism as a subject, I was not surprisingly very interested in what is essentially a tourist guidebook, but for African Americans specifically. And the fact that it's nationwide and not just for the Deep South where there were Jim Crow laws. We know, of course, that Jim Crow as a general concept was nationwide. It did not require laws. It was also about customs of discrimination. And so the Greenbook, I should say first, why it's called the Greenbook. It's, of course, not just because, if you're not familiar with it, it's not just because it has a green cover. There are other books that use terms like Greenbook. There was, I can think of one other one at least that was called the Greenbook in the early 20th century that was actually a travel guide, believe it or not, but had nothing to do with African Americans. This, however, the one that everyone now knows, I think in part thanks to the movie, sort of lifted it up, was the work of a man whose last name was Green, pictured here. This is Victor Hugo Green from New York, and he was a postal carrier. And if you think about what postal carriers do, they learn as they carry the mail to different addresses, they learn at a very intimate, granular level what's where and who's where. And if they were going to recommend places, we think of these web services like Yelp, where you find out, go to another city and where am I going to eat? Well, let's go on the Yelp app or wherever. You read reviews and puzzle over it. But this was something that was curated by a man starting in New York City based on his personal knowledge of where African Americans would find good treatment and lack of discrimination, dignity and respect. He did this for 2 years from 1936 to 1937 as a New York City-based project. He and his wife, Alma, it was a husband and wife team. She was very much part of the process. But he also had a network of people that he developed over time, not only through his own travels, but through his own meeting people, getting in touch and asking them for other people to be informants, basically, so that he learned through this network and through his own travels what places he would recommend beyond New York City. And so that's how the first guides that became, starting in 1938, a national guide. And they continued on until the 1966-67 edition was the last one. And if you think about when that was, it's a couple of years after the Civil Rights Act. And as is well known, once integration is the law of the land, it had a profound effect on Black businesses. And it was not only good or only bad, it was a mixed kind of development because Black businesses had served Black patrons in part out of necessity, and it was within the community. Everyone lived within a community that had to be interdependent and self-reliant in the context of broader discrimination. As that began to lessen through legislation and the forceful changes that came out of civil rights activism and governmental responses to that, the critical burning need for that lessened. And so that was a good development. But of course, the downside of that was it did lead to the dissolution of a lot of these Black-owned businesses that then could not compete in the same way because people no longer required going to a Black-owned hotel to be treated right. They could choose sometimes a place that might be closer to where their business or their pleasure would take them. They wouldn't necessarily have to be relegated to only choosing one place in a city. They now had a choice of several. And so you can imagine how that had a profound effect. So how does this relate to Greenbook Cleveland? As an urban historian, I mentioned that I do public history and digital history, but I also study cities and tourism. And so I was interested in a digital project that would document the Greenbook sites that were first in Cleveland. That was the starting point. And so there's a lot more I could say about why now as opposed to, say, 10 years ago, but in the interest of time, I won't go there. I'll just say that that the Greenbook Cleveland project started out with this idea of what can we learn about the places that were in the Greenbook editions from the 1930s to the 1960s. Where were they? Who owned them? What did they look like? What happened there? What's the history? What's the story? Do people remember these places if we were to begin to reach out and ask the right questions and find the right people? So that's what kind of got the idea going. I was also interested, though, in what happened beyond the Greenbook itself, because I had also been doing a lot of reading about environmental history and about that in the connection with race. So where did African Americans go to find green spaces? And I know that's a big part of what this series is about, is thinking about water and green space, park spaces. Where did African Americans go beyond the city limits? Not necessarily to Black-owned businesses, but for leisure and recreation of a different sort. More, where did they swim? Where did they go to ride horseback? Those sorts of things. Go fishing, hunting. And so often these things don't happen inside the city limits. They happen out on the fringes or out in the rural areas of our region. So that's why this project very quickly was reconceptualized as something that would be regional and would not just look at where did Black tourists go when they came to Cleveland, but where did Black Clevelanders go for fun in and around the city. And of course, when you think about this, these flows are not unidirectional, right? And you start thinking about Cleveland and Akron are only 39 miles apart. Was there no interconnection between Black communities and places between Cleveland and Akron? Well, of course there was. Was there interaction with Youngstown? Of course there was. And you start thinking all these multi-directional flows. People going from Akron to Cleveland, Cleveland to Akron, Youngstown to Lorraine, Lorraine to wherever. And so this became a regional project. It was not focused on outsiders' experience of the local or locals' experience of other cities, but really some of both. So that is why the project got conceptualized as it is. So we developed, this is sort of the second iteration of the look of the website. It's a map-based project that actually uses a WordPress plugin that we developed with an NEH grant in 2020 at CSU called PlacePress. And so it enables geolocation of stories and tours in a WordPress environment. And so we developed this project in that way. And I'm going to just very quickly show you one little snippet of how, since we don't have a projector, hopefully you can sort of see a little bit that this is, there's a map, and you can drill down into the map. This is only showing resorts. So you can look by location type. You can also search by place name. You can search by the edition of the Greenbook, or you can go to different, did I say location? I think I said location types. So location types are places that are within the Greenbook and those that extend beyond. Ones in the Greenbook certainly included, I'll just give you about 3 examples: barbershops and beauty parlors, garages and service stations, hotels and tourist homes. These are some of the categories that you would find in the Greenbook. But to those, we added some others that were not in the Greenbook, and it reflects this more regional focus. Things like picnic groves, lagoons, lakes, and ponds, beaches, amusement parks, summer camps. So that gives you a bit of a flavor for some of these types of places. Don mentioned Benny Mason's Farm. And that's one of the sites, of course, that was both listed in the Greenbook. Strangely, only for 1 or 2 years. I forget if it's 1 or 2 in the late 30s. Of course, this place was around for decades. Why was it only in the Greenbook for a short time? That's a really interesting and, I think, for me, unanswerable question, at least as I stand here before you today. There are those anomalies like that. Why did a place appear 1 year, like the Bluegrass Club on East 55th Street is another one, but it was around for a couple of decades? What happened to change that? I don't know. That's the kind of thing that maybe through oral history, someone has some idea. They may tell a story about maybe some incident happened there, or maybe fell out of favor with visitors from other cities that remained popular with locals. Who knows? So these really interesting questions that I think that documenting these stories bring to light that we may never be able to answer, but it doesn't hurt to ponder them. So I want to give you a flavor for some of the different types of things we've discovered. And I won't show these to you because it's a little awkward turning the screen back and forth and navigating. But beyond, one of the things I found really interesting was that, I mentioned that there are all these different flows of people in different directions. There are also these interesting connections with owners and operators of these various attractions. So Benny Mason, for example. Benny Mason had his hand in a whole lot of pies, basically. I mean, he was involved in a lot of businesses. And people who worked for Benny Mason as managers or servers or entertainers, they also were involved in other businesses around town. So someone might play jazz out at Benny Mason's farm, but they also played at clubs that he had a stake in the Cedar Central neighborhood on the east side of Cleveland. He had business associates like managers and other workers, chefs who served patrons at the farm, but then at other times they also worked in some of the east side clubs. So there are all these interesting connections. There were other entrepreneurs we found the same kind of arrangement with. These were people who sometimes made their homes in what we now call the Fairfax neighborhood, south of Cleveland Clinic. Other times they lived up in the Glenville neighborhood. There were some, some pretty wealthy men who, owned businesses who had very large, impressive homes on East Boulevard, along the Cultural Gardens, and who owned some of these Greenbook businesses. So it's really interesting that we think about these places are mostly gone. Part of the story of American history is the destruction, the erasure of the black built environment through urban renewal, highway development or freeways, demolition programs, landlord neglect, redlining by banks, by insurance companies, by federal underwriters of mortgages, and the list goes on and on. There are all kinds of reasons that Black people lost their property. There was also racial violence, and there are stories of that in the Greenbook Cleveland project, where sadly farms and businesses were burned to the ground or vandalized to the point that the owners got out. So there are all kinds of ways that Black people and their property were separated, forcibly or through policy. That's interwoven with American history, sadly. But I find it interesting that not only is there an opportunity to bring these stories back to life and to engage the public in trying to remember and restore and recollect and reimagine what our region might be, with those stories now being passed down to other generations. I also imagine thinking about how it's easier sometimes to feel a connection to people in the past when you can see something that they left behind physically. That's harder to do when the Greenbook businesses are largely gone, bulldozed sometimes decades ago. However, I mentioned that some of the homes of the owners are still around. So those are points of connection as well that I think we should keep in our minds. Where did the people who built these Greenbook businesses live? And are those places still around? May they be preserved? May they be marked? May the public come to know them in the way that knows the homes of white people so often. So many white people's homes get marked as historic, and you don't see that as much with African American homes. They're not. It's starting to change, but we have an opportunity that we shouldn't let pass. We shouldn't, assume that, there's no story to these places. We need to figure out where there are stories that connect the places still standing, and then advocate for those places not disappearing in the future. I didn't realize we're so close to a train, railroad, but we're apparently very close. I hear it outside. Where was I? So I want to move from there to how we've begun to broaden the project. Eric Schnack is sitting in back here, and Eric is at the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, and is also a recent graduate of Cleveland State's Master of Arts in History program, Museum Studies specialization. And Eric was in the class when we started this project. So he was in on the ground floor with this. And so he's also, as someone who brings this unique perspective of being in the park and also at CSU, he saw both sides of this, and he was part of what brought this project together with the National Park, which has its own story of interest in how Black leisure, entertainment, and recreation connect to its history. So as a place that's smack in the middle between Cleveland and Akron, and is rapidly approaching its 50th anniversary, CVNP is very interested in documenting its own origin story and how it connects and interconnects with that of the larger Northeast Ohio region. And so, of course, Black history is integral to this larger story. And so how can this project also enrich the interpretive opportunities and educational opportunities for the public when they visit the park, to learn about how did African Americans use the park, when were they welcome, when were they excluded, before the park even formed. So I'm talking about the land that predated the National Park Service. We know there were Black farmers, we know there were Black clubs and businesses in or around the park, a Black summer camp in the middle of what's now the park. So all of these stories, and then also those stories of where people went when they didn't feel welcome in official park spaces. And I'm also talking about places like Metro Parks, the Cleveland Metro Park system, the Summit Metro Park system. There are lots of park spaces, some of which African Americans historically used and others that they didn't use. Places they felt welcome, places they sometimes did not experience welcome. And so learning more about that geography, that experience is part of this endeavor too. And that's how we really brought this group of partners together. It's principally a partnership between Cleveland State University, the Center for Public History and Digital Humanities that I direct, and Cuyahoga Valley National Park. And then our collaborators are several that are interested in either parks, public lands more broadly, or specific communities. So we're working with Third Space Action Lab in the Glenville neighborhood as an example of that, and starting to talk to potential partners in the Akron area. So I think what I'd like to do is to pause and ask if we can sort of open up a discussion or answer any questions. If I could just go on and on telling you, I'm happy if you want to ask me questions about specific types of places and get me to give you examples, whatever would be helpful, I'm happy to do.
I have heard the Green Book, I've never seen it. What I was wondering about, perhaps you could address this briefly. My understanding is this was a guide, and that would indicate that the way it was put together was that people would go out and sort of explore what's available, where is it, when's it open, and how would they go about, can you talk a little bit about how that was organized and how that kind of information gathering turned into the book? That's one part of the inquiry. The other is, it was broader in scope than the state of Ohio, wasn't it?
Of course, yeah.
It was national.
Very much.
So we're talking about something that if you wanted to do it right, we're talking about a big book. There must have been a network of, if you were trying to figure out what could you do in Northeast Ohio, that would be a different thing than what you could do in West Virginia. So how was that organized?
That's a great question. So Victor Green traveled a lot, for starters.
What did he do?
Well, he was a postal carrier originally before he started he moved from there into travel services. So in fact, there's a copy of one coming around. So he got into travel services, but he started out as a postal carrier. And so through his work for the Postal Service, he met other people in the post office in other cities, partly through his travels. And then they knew other people. So the network expanded through those discussions so that he didn't have to cover the entire United States himself and personally vouch for 100% of the places, because that's not humanly possible for one man or for him and his wife, for that matter, to go everywhere. So they did have a network. And I think that partly answers the question of why places kind of came and went, because that network probably changed over time. And it probably was the case that as that network evolved over a 30-year period, that he may not have been able to confirm that certain places remained worthy of inclusion as different people weighed into the project, and so some places fell away if they couldn't be vouched for over time. Let's see, you had a second part of the question. I'm sorry, I now forgot what it was. The thickness of the book you mentioned, maybe I could speak to. how this was always very selective because of the fact that it was a fairly, it was not like, Fodor's or, Bedecker or any of the other historical or contemporary guides that have many, many, many people checking all the details. So you never, even in the book is, it's that at least that copy of it comes out to, looks like about, 3/4 of an inch to an inch thick.
It gets thicker as you go along.
Yeah. It's very selective. So over the course of 30 years, there's a grand total of around 60 to 65, I forget the exact number, between 60 and 65 businesses in Cleveland proper that were in the Green Book over a 30-year period, some of which were there for all 30 years, others, they were there 1 year maybe. So that tells you that it's a tiny sliver of all that's out there. So it's very much a curated guidebook. And it didn't get down to that more granular level of giving you information about, access to a menu for a restaurant, or here are the hours, or, all the kinds of things that now we would expect because they're essential information, or at least a link to someone's website now. These were very cryptic. If you sort of flip through, you'll quickly see it's just like a list of it has a name and it has an address. And by the way, sometimes the addresses were wrong. They sometimes transposed addresses. So they had I think, if I remember right, the Bluegrass Club, they erroneously listed as being on Cedar when it was on East 55th. And they put some other place that was actually the reverse. They transposed addresses somehow. And that even came up in an article in the Cleveland Post, the weekly newspaper here. In 1946, there was an article commenting on how the Green Book was this great guide, but they had gotten a few things wrong in Cleveland. They had all these addresses mixed up in that one edition. So they said, use it with care. Anyone who's visiting from outside, they need to be a little, they need to do their own research to be sure that it's right.
The first part of the question you partially answered, but it had to do with once this information was collected, I'm assuming it was collated. Somebody went through the process, collating it, putting it together, getting it printed, getting it bound, getting it available. How did all that work? Was this something you could buy at a newsstand or through a church, or how did you get this?
Esso gas stations were the biggest single place that this was distributed nationally. So he had an arrangement with the Esso service stations to have this nationwide. And so not all places carried this, and it was not something that was, just at every bookstore.
It must have been an interesting business deal.
Yeah.
I wonder how that came into existence, and who did what, and who got what for that.
That's what I need to look into more, and the answer to that is available. I'm sorry I don't have it right here for you. Should have anticipated that, but I think I can find that information. Eric has.
Got the answer. So he was actually friends with the marketing director of Esso, which is now Exxon, by the way.
Right.
So I guess he was chummy with the marketing director, and he thought it would be a good idea to spread the word because they were good friends.
That's interesting. Yeah, this has got great entries.
Yeah.
Lloyd's of White Plains. Let's see. Delight in every bite, Southern restaurant, wines, liquors, and dancing, open day and night.
Yeah.
118 Martin Avenue, White Plains.
Ads were a source of a lot of information for us, at least in sort of trying to go beyond what was in the sometimes very cryptic entries. Using the Post, which had tons of advertisements that gave important details. Who was the cook at this restaurant? Who was the owner? Who was the proprietor of that club? What was their slogan? What did they specialize in their own words? What was the menu? Some of the restaurants, we could actually see what they served. So we could characterize, what kind of food is it? Is it barbecue? Is it seafood? Is it some of both? Is it something entirely different? I'll tell you one of the interesting things, speaking of food, that connects both parts of this project, interestingly, you may have heard of Hot Sauce Williams, the barbecue place. Well, the name Hot Sauce Williams goes all the way back to a man who was nicknamed Hot Sauce. His name was Eugene Williams, and he was originally from Louisiana and came up to Cleveland in the Great Migration, and he opened Williams Barbecue on Central Avenue, just off of, I think, 49th Street, East 49th. And it grew into a chain, a local chain. It predated the current Hot Sauce Williams, which actually, and this is kind of, it gets kind of complicated because there's another Williams family that came up from Mississippi later in the second Great Migration and opened a barbecue stand in the Huff neighborhood. And this was actually after the original Hot Sauce Williams died by a few years. And the people who went to this new barbecue stand told this new Williams family that owned it that it reminded them so much of Hot Sauce Williams sauce that they just started nicknaming the place Hot Sauce Williams because they were named Williams also, and the name stuck, and eventually that name just got transferred. What I don't know with certainty is whether there might have been some relation. The name Williams is obviously very common. I don't know of a connection, and the story seems to suggest that there was not one. But the connection between the Greenbook versus non-Greenbook sites, one thing we learned in doing this project was that Eugene Williams bought a farm just up the road, up Cochran Road from Benny Mason's farm. And that's where he started growing the hogs, the cattle for his meat in his restaurant. It's also where he started growing the herbs and spices to put in his secret recipe for the sauce, because he used to go down to New Orleans regularly and get ingredients and for that, but he started growing his own. So it's interesting stories, and that was the farm, of course, was not in the Greenbook, but we put it on the site because we wanted to help make that connection. That here was a black entrepreneur who had land out in Solon, in the mid 20th century, which that's not a place that you really think to look, I think, in the 21st century. You wouldn't necessarily look at that and say, I bet that there was a big black community in Solon in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. You wouldn't assume that necessarily. But there's a history of black farm ownership too in our region, just as there is in other regions, that there's a lot to learn about it. Any other questions or comments or suggestions?
It's good to see you again. And I'm so happy to meet another Cleveland State graduate from the Levin Urban College. I know there are at least two, there are probably more groups. One of them is Journey on Yonder, that Kim Smith Woodford started, and the other one, Ebony Hood and her mom, I can't remember the name of it.
See you at the top.
See you at the top. These organizations are trying to bring recreation and outdoor experiences to African Americans, particularly youth. And there just seems to be a million blazing connections between what they're trying to do and what you're, presenting with the park. So I just, wondered if there's, a space where, maybe they can be helping to spread the word or take that information and, get it into people's hands to experience it. But I just wasn't aware if you're working with these types of groups, more in a current sense.
We haven't, but this is the type of thing we want to know, because we've talked to various groups, and we've ended up starting in a small way, I think, by focusing in, for example, with the Glendale neighborhood and Third Space Action Lab. We're trying to be careful that we don't promise too much, we don't make connections that we can't really be actively involved with and closely involved with all at once. But we're definitely interested, so I don't want that to sound like we're only interested in Glendale, because that's hardly the case. We have lots of interest in connecting all over Greater Cleveland and Akron. So I'd love an email actually introducing us to them, and we'd love to talk with them about it. And one, just so that we know what other people are doing and they know what we're doing and we can see where the overlapping interests are. And two, maybe there's a way to do something more programmatic, even if we don't do it immediately, we at least get kind of familiar with each other's work. So definitely interested.
There's also a group called the Black Environmental Leaders Association. I don't know anybody on there, but there might be a connection there, or a desire to have a connection there with the
They have been
information.
on our radar. In fact, we're working with the Trust for Public Lands, the Ohio division of that, and we talked about that group,
Okay.
about reaching out to them. So, thank you.
So there's a parallel effort, kind of getting the oral histories and connectivity of green space. I saw the Cleveland Metro Parks on your partner list, and I worked with Whitney Long Jones with Organic Connects on putting a survey out around Garfield Park Reservation specifically. They're working on some meaningful restorations and neighborhood connections, and they were working with the neighborhood right around Garfield Park Reservation on really seeing what the connection is to the park when people use the trails, when people use the facilities, that kind of thing, and then seeing how they can better make it more of a equitable, welcoming space for everybody. So that was a interesting exercise that was done not too long ago, a couple years back. I don't know if you had that info or not from them, but if not, Garfield Park Reservation would be one that would be cool to, at least interesting to see if there's connection and all that to the efforts here.
Yeah, especially because, in the I don't have the date right in front of mind, but I'll say late 60s or early 70s. It's right around that point. I know there was an issue that arose with many public swimming pools about integration of the pools, or the pool there. And I know that was one place where there were racial clashes over integrating the pool, but ultimately it did. But what happened to some degree, like happened in a lot of places, is there's this effort by whites to defend this space as whites only. And then there's this brief moment of integration, but then there's white flight that follows. And you see just sort of like a revolving door where it goes from being all white to all black. And to some degree, I think that happened there initially, at least. But there's a prehistory to all that too, that one thing, and I don't remember specifically about Garfield Park, became reservation, Cleveland Metro Parks Reservation there. But I know in some of the other Metro Parks reservations, there's a long and farther back history of Black users of the parks, especially going there for picnics and horseback riding, to the key things. For example, the South Chagrin Reservation and the Brecksville Reservation, both. Bedford Reservation is the one I meant to say. In particular, had Black usage in, say, the 1930s. And did that continue straight on through, or did it fall off? And now that we're trying to rebuild that sense of welcome, those are the kinds of things I think, like what you're talking about. Who uses the place now, and how, and what's their sense of this as, is this a place that initially felt welcome, or did it take some convincing to use it? I think that's kind of part of what this is about too. It's getting people to think historically and in the present about space, and how we relate to it. How do we make it more equitable? And my hope, one of several hopes for this project, is that this encourages people to learn the context that can then help them advocate for more inclusive spaces, whatever that looks like. It doesn't all have to revolve around this hub of Greenbook Cleveland. Some of it may, and some of it may just be inspired by what people may read and learn from the project, and decide to do projects that are completely separate to make things better. So I hope that this will be widely used in all kinds of ways that we either can or can't imagine.
Yeah.
Any other questions? And I'm happy to give Eric some time. I don't know if you want to say anything, Eric. I mean, because there's Sure,
Yeah.
there's time for it, and I know there's interest.
I do have to say
You can
the,
come up if you want to.
Yeah. so these,
Peter's camera.
These projects, I mean, they don't happen in a vacuum, right? And it's difficult to get this kind of history recorded on your own. So having these, regional partners, especially a strong one like the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, is integral in making these things happen. So a partner that can leverage, you have a civil rights grant, right, from the National Park Service that was leveraged for this project specifically. So that kind of tied your two offices together. And a partner that's also able to dedicate so many resources towards this effort. So thank you and your team for everything you're doing for this and kind of connecting all the dots of the other folks in the area. So I want to hear your vantage on this.
So I would just like to speak a little bit to some of the sites in the Cuyahoga Valley, just because I'm so interested in them, and they really make the landscape of the Cuyahoga Valley come alive. So I grew up in Broadview Heights, about 15 minutes outside of the Cuyahoga Valley National Park. And growing up, I was very familiar with the history of the canal, very familiar with the history of the Civilian Conservation Corps. But Black history in the Cuyahoga Valley, I had never heard of anything like that. And I think the reason why I hadn't heard of any of those sites is because 95% of these Greenbook sites no longer exist. Namely, in the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, the sites that we have researched, they no longer exist within the park. Doing some of this research in the valley and looking at those sites, something that has really inspired me and something that I think brings all of this history to life, as Dr. Souther mentioned earlier, are some of these protagonists in the history. So some of these characters that really bring it to life. I think in the Cuyahoga Valley particularly, we had two blues and jazz clubs. One was called Lake Glen and the other was called the Cabin Club. And at these venues, you have these prolific musicians playing. There's some advertisements for Dizzy Gillespie, Count Basie, all of those folks that were musicians really making a national impact. Like Dr. Souther mentioned, the significance of Akron. Akron was very significant in the jazz scene, being sandwiched between New York and Chicago. You had all of those musicians passing through. And when you're passing through to perform at a club in, say, Akron, it's just a 15-minute drive to the Cuyahoga Valley. So looking through the Cleveland Call-and-Post, the African-American newspaper in Cleveland, you can learn about some of these sites and you learn about some of these characters. And two characters that I'm always drawn to, that I speak about a lot, are Billy McAllister and Crown Prince Waterford. Billy McAllister was an early drag artist during that period in time in the 50s. They would have been called a female impersonator. And Crown Prince Waterford, he was a blues musician that performed at the Cuyahoga Valley's clubs. Now I'm really drawn to these two characters because I think that they draw a national theme to the Valley in their work and their lives. So, on one hand, Billy McAllister, the drag artist, they were sort of the MC, the master of ceremonies for two of these clubs, Cabin Club and Lake Glen. And you see night after night, Billy McAllister hosting these wonderful sessions with comedians and musicians. And so there's that story of LGBTQ history, really, in the Valley. And you really wouldn't have thought it until you look for it. And then Crown Prince Waterford, on the other hand, he was a blues musician who played with Mr. Pete Johnson. Pete Johnson, for those of you who are music buffs out there, music history fans, he was the father of boogie woogie piano. So I guarantee you, everybody in this audience here at one point has listened to rock and roll, and that rock and roll probably had that rolling piano, really fast piano, blues playing. Mr. Pete Johnson he invented that. And Crown Prince Waterford and his friends performed that music in the Valley and in the Akron area and up here in Cleveland. And I think we don't even need to be involved in the project to connect with this history. You can pull up a music streaming service and listen to these musicians, and it really brings the recreation and leisure and entertainment to life. So I encourage everybody just to find your local archive or find somebody who's a little bit older than you and talk about some history with them, because you'll find some great characters and you'll find some good protagonists that I think that we can learn a lot from in the present day. And I'm happy to be a part of this project.
All right, well, thank you all. So this is being recorded, so we can share this this discussion with other folks. I'll be posting it on our website, and we will be sharing it out to our networks of people. I urge you all to go on to the Greenbook Cleveland and explore it and learn the history. And if there's any connections that folks know, reach out to the team and see how we might be able to enhance this even further to make it as impactful as possible. So folks, this is the Our Nature series, forum series, and we have a couple more. We have one down at the Conservancy for the National Park, Low Power Happy Hour. On the flyer that's here, it says May 2nd. It has been moved since the flyer was made to May 9th. So if you would like to go to that one, we're looking at the development practice and history of North Akron with Reverend Michael Howard from Living Waters Association, who's one of the sponsors of the Our Nature series. So he is a very well-spoken, wonderful man, and he has a great crew of people and a panel that's going to be on May 9th down there. So you can go on to communitylifecollaborative.org and find that on our events page. We also have a workshop series that's going to be on May 20th at our facility in Bainbridge. So please keep in touch and stay tuned. So thank you very much for attending. Check out the materials in the back, grab some materials from Union Miles and from us as well over on the table, and we'll see you at the next one. Thanks.
Fine.